So yeah, I'm Jonny Hall. I'm a LSE Fellow in US foreign policy analysis. I have one paper on populism, which is why I'm guessing I've been given the honor of moderating this today. I really don't have anything to say for 5 minutes, but I mean, I'll let Georg talk in more detail about the topic today, which is obviously related to US foreign policy and populism, which I think there's a very fruitful relationship, and there's been lots of work on that. So Georg is now a lecturer in US foreign policy at Queen Mary. I definitely didn't apply for that job either. I can speak for Georg's aptitude as a teacher because he taught me many moons ago and probably inspired me to be where I am today, teaching on US foreign policy and US security policy at the University of Warwick. His most recent book, I'm trying to get the title of because I know it exists. Georg, do you want to tell me? No, I've got it.
The Politics of Antagonism, now available by Routledge.
The Populist is Politics of Antagonism, the Populist Security Imaginary, and the Remaking of Political Identity. And that builds on some of the work that Georg's been doing on populism in the last few years in terms of there's lots of journal articles to that as well, working with people like Alex Homelar at the University of Warwick as well. And I think a really interesting exploration of thinking about what the drivers of populism are, and particularly in this US context. So I strongly encourage you to purchase that book yourself or to recommend it to your librarian, and also to check out some of Georg's other works. So without further ado, I'll stop rambling on. I'll give the floor to Georg, and then we'll go from there.
All right, thanks very much, Jonny, for this really kind and generous introduction, and also to the invitation here today. So let me just share the slides I have for today with you, which I think, so you should be seeing an America First hat and Donald Trump hugging the flag. So the title for the lecture is America First and a Populist Impact on US Foreign Policy, which essentially is based on an article that I published in Survival a couple of years back, and which I then expanded into a chapter in my book, The Politics of Antagonism, which essentially applies the analytical framework of a populist security imaginary to the issues of voter mobilization and policy legitimation under the Trump presidency. And the core premise of the book is essentially that populist communication, populist mobilization, populist legitimation of policy functions primarily via the avenue of security and insecurity. To put it very simply, nationalist populism of the kind that Trump represents amplifies the ontological insecurities of a core constituency of white working class voters in the rural heartland. Anxiety about globalization, fear of immigrants, resentment of elites and the establishment, anger against a whole host of hostile ideologies, institutions, and political domestic opponents. And all of that is essentially amplified in populist rhetoric, and it is also directed against not just domestic enemies, but also very much against external enemies. In the parlance of Trump, we had a European Union that was a foe. We had Germans that were bad because they were not paying enough for NATO. We had China that was ruthless, and the list goes on. All right, so just let me walk you through a little what I had in mind for today. So first, a couple of introductory remarks on populism and how I see populism, how I approach populism, how I study populism. And then we're going to go right into the meat of the issue here today, which is the populist impact on foreign policy, to be more precise, the populist impact on US foreign policy under the Trump presidency, which we can subsume under this moniker of America First, like this paradigm of America First. So first I want to look at how was America First framed? How did it work as a discourse? What were the central narrative elements here that were combined in America First? Then I want to look a little bit at what was the ideational dimension, what was the practical dimension, because there is actually like a massive discrepancy here between this rhetoric of a populist revolution in Washington and then what actually happened structurally in US foreign policy in terms of how much did change. The third is, why was America First popular? Why did it connect with voters? And here we need to talk about a gap, a representational gap between elite and public opinion in the United States when it comes to US foreign policy, in particular when it comes to the degree of America's global engagement, from free trade to military interventions. And then finally, a particular interesting aspect about America First is that it was something of a narrative shock, a disruption, and a disruption in particular to the discursive authority and the legitimacy of a bipartisan US foreign policy establishment. Simply put, before Donald Trump came into office, there was only one grand strategy. There was only one idea about America's role in the world. And that was pretty much liberal hegemony. There was this idea of an identity policy nexus of American exceptionalism, military interventionism, America as the leader of the liberal international order. And Trump's America First discourse very much disrupted this and sort of widened the debate space, if you will, on both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So even if America First wasn't a coherent and consistent grand strategy, it discursively definitely showed that there were more alternatives possible and they couldn't all be sort of delegitimated with this idea of isolationism. All right, let's start a little bit with what is populism. Now, because Trump is so ubiquitous in political reporting in the media, in political science, we sometimes think that, like, you know, the story of populism sort of starts with Trump. And at least for the United States, this is definitely not the case. So when we look to a definition of what populism constitutes, I think at its most basic, populism is an antagonistic logic that redefines politics as an opposition, as an existential struggle between the people and the elite. Right? As Michael Kazin put it, populism is a language whose speakers conceive of the people as a noble assemblage, not bounded narrowly by class. For you, the elite opponents are self-serving and undemocratic and seek to mobilize the former against the latter. And that is exactly what Trump has done time and time again in his campaign rallies, on his social media output, in his interviews. He denigrated the Washington establishment as the Washington swamp. He presents himself as the man of the people, articulating the will of the people, fighting for ordinary Americans against nefarious foreigners, against illegal immigrants that are predominantly framed as terrorists and criminals, against the woke liberals that are seeking to unmake the American dream. But populism has actually a long-standing history in the United States. So the first populist formations go all the way back to the 19th century, to various nativist and anti-establishment groups. So we have the Know Nothing Party, which was a nativist populist party that was especially hostile to immigration from majority Catholic countries. So in that time, particular Ireland, Italy, parts of Germany, those immigrants were seen as un-American, as the other that had to be rejected. We had the Farmer Alliances Party and the People's Party, who sought to defend small business owners and farmers, particularly in the Midwest, against the large East Coast corporations and banks, with pretty much the same, populist dichotomy of there's the evil elites that are concentrating power and influence, and they are amassing wealth and power at the expense of small, ordinary Americans. And then these populist elements re-emerge periodically in American politics. So we had the Louisiana governor and Senator Huey Long, the so-called Kingfish, in the late 1920s and early 1930s. We had the Tea Party that sprung up in opposition to the Obama administration, in particular Obamacare, advocating for a radically reduced tax regime in the United States, amassing a lot of also the particular white xenophobic resentment that would later be a hallmark of Trump's followers. We had Ross Perot running for the president, James Buchanan. So populism isn't anything particularly new, and it doesn't start with Donald Trump. And what we can say, one of the most significant elements, I would say, in right-wing or nationalist populism is this idea of nativism, that the nation belongs to natural-born citizens, and that foreigners, immigrants, they need to be kept out. So part and parcel of Trump's populist rhetoric is always the real America, the real Americans, right? The heartland America. So we have this idealization of, in particular, rural populations. And there is a clear marker here that real Americans is heartland America, and everyone else, the bi-coast elite, college-educated liberals, the matcha latte slurping, New York Times reading, Vocarati, those are not real Americans. This is the enemy of the American people. And also the enemy of the American people is illegal, unauthorized migrants, which are predominantly framed as criminals and terrorists, right? So Trump goes on and on about MS-13, for example. The very announcement of his presidential candidacy in 2015, he talked about Mexicans as rapists and drug dealers. So this extreme polarization in nationalist populism via these security narratives, this is what I call in my book the populist security imaginary. And I think what really goes on here is that essentially in this nationalist populist rhetoric and with these nationalist populist narratives, we have a reframing of political identity. And the result of this reframing of political identity in the United States is that the idea of the nation, this imagined community of the nation, essentially becomes shrunken down to match up with the popular community of heartland America, right? Predominantly white, working class, non-college educated voters, predominantly in the Midwest and in the South. So Trump's MAGA base essentially becomes the only relevant representative of American democracy, of political authority, of political legitimacy. And no other institutional check, if you will, in the American Constitution, whether that is the courts or whether that is the press or whether that is even Congress, is ultimately relevant. That, of course, was the culmination, if you will, on January 6th, right? That Trump convinced his followers the election had been stolen from them, the real Americans, the real representatives of American democracy, from the nefarious evil elites, from the Democratic Party and their allies. So there you can see also the danger of this mobilizing potential of this popular security imaginary. But I digress, and our topic for today is US foreign policy and America first. So just keep it a little bit in mind how this popular security imaginary works, because this very much plays out in the context of foreign policy and in the context of America first. So as I said, first I want to talk a little bit about how America first is framed as a discourse. And in a nutshell here, you can already see this encapsulated by this quote that Trump gave in September 2016. We must replace the present policy of globalism, which has moved so many jobs and so much wealth out of our country, and replace it with a new policy of Americanism, right? The global versus the national is essentially the same dichotomy that we have, the people versus the elite. And those actually fuse in Trump's America First rhetoric. So we have a populist anti-elitism that fuses with a nationalist anti-globalism, because the globalist elites, and this includes both Trump's Republican and Democratic predecessors, are responsible for a failed globalist foreign and economic policy. Lax immigration policy that opens the borders to all these supposed criminals and terrorists. A devastating free trade policy that resulted in free trade deals that shipped American jobs overseas and led to the erosion of American manufacturing and American industrial decline. Embroiling the United States in costly wars and failed military interventions. I think it's important to say here that some of what Trump actually picks up here with is not completely wrong. Free trade has had adverse economic effects in the United States, locally concentrated in particular in communities, for example, in the deindustrializing Rust Belt. However, not all of these effects can exclusively be attributed to trade, but also to automation, digitization, for example. And yes, American military interventions have failed, and the American people are turning increasingly wary against military interventions. But Trump takes these very complex problems, 9/11 and its aftermath, international trade under the conditions of globalization, and he presents a very simplistic picture of globalization, or globalism is bad and evil, and it is the ideology of misguided, nefarious elites, and whatever they did, I will undo, and then I will bring America back. And this panacea, if you will, in Trump's populist security imaginary is the restoration of national sovereignty, the restoration of America's national power and America's influence in the world. And this is supposedly achieved predominantly by tools such as tariffs and import quotas that can be nationally imposed, by ripping up these free trade agreements, by bringing the troops home, and by also being hostile to these globalist international institutions, policies, ideologies that have sort of gotten us into this mess in the first place. So Trump then not just fuses nationalism and populism, but also he borrows from a realist IR theory. In the world is zero sum. For America to gain, for America to win, everybody else needs to lose. So there is no liberal international order that is based on the idea of mutual cooperation for mutual benefit, like a win-win scenario. America must win, everybody else needs to lose, and that doesn't just include sort of traditional rivals like Iran and Russia and China, but it also very much includes long-standing US allies like Canada, like the European Union, like Germany, for example. So when the Trump administration passed tariffs on the imports of steel and aluminum, because they were supposedly eroding US national security, those tariffs weren't just slapped on China, they were also slapped on Canada and on the European Union. So what we are seeing is that the international sphere, the international system, is essentially framed as a source of decline, of insecurity, as a loss of American influence. And this narrative of insecurity, of weakness, of vulnerability is then used to attack domestic elites, to attack the Washington Swamp, because they are responsible for this terrible situation that America finds itself in. And what America first does, narratively, discursively, is essentially that Trump is saying, I will protect you. I will protect the prosperity and safety and security of ordinary Americans, because those are exactly those who have been neglected and let down by our elites, by both Republican and Democratic administrations that negotiated these free trade agreements, that pursued this failed immigration policy, that pursued this interventionist foreign policy. And you can see this quote here by Trump's inaugural address in the January of 2017, when he says, from this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first, America first. Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, and foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. So there you can see this populist discourse, right? It is a policy that is geared for the people and not the elite. So this domestic conceptual antagonism in populist rhetoric becomes translated onto foreign policy, becomes translated onto the international sphere. Now, did they actually achieve that? And is America First a grand strategy? Is it a Trump doctrine? Now here it gets a little bit more tricky. Probably the closest the Trump administration came in formulating America First as an actual grand strategy, as something of a policy agenda, came with the national security strategy that was passed in December of 2017. And there's a couple of things that stand out here. Very importantly, the national security strategy very much reflects Trump's views that the international arena is a source of vulnerability and insecurity, and that ordinary Americans need to be protected. And what the national security strategy does is that explicitly linking US national security to homeland and border security. In particular, for example, construction of the US-Mexico border wall to, as it says in the text, to secure porous borders and prevent the influx of criminal cartels bringing drugs and danger into our communities, right? Again, we need to protect the popular community. We need to protect ordinary Americans from the dangers that lurk beyond our borders. And national security is also linked to economic security. So targeting unfair trade practices that have weakened our economy. This would result, for example, in the Trump administration renegotiating both NAFTA and the US-South Korea free trade agreement. However, in both these renegotiations, the Trump administration only actually achieved marginal concessions. So very importantly, when we look at America First, is that it is an antagonistic impulse, but it isn't really a coherent or consistent strategy. And this is because populism in and itself is a very flexible logic, but it is also very amorphous. It is always about rather what you are against, rather what you are for. And we see this, for example, in the Trump administration renegotiating free trade deals, but they're not canceling them. They're not canceling them outright, for example. Trump is very hostile against NATO, but then in practice, as we see later, they are still supporting NATO in practice. And so Trump's sort of like populist bluster and blunder very much comes up against a status quo oriented national security establishment, including his own Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, later Mike Pompeo, his national security advisors. So by and large, the Trump administration at the important levers of power in diplomacy, in defense and intelligence, these are not nationalist populist revolutionaries, but they basically want to promote the strategic continuity of liberal hegemony. But there is one element where I would say we have a genuine revolutionary element or a genuine novel element, and that is Trump's rejection of American exceptionalism. Because on the one side, America First, as I said, with this zero-sum sort of principled realism, is essentially rejecting the cooperative engagement that was sort of like the hallmark of Barack Obama's presidency and approach to foreign policy, right? Burden sharing, working with allies and partners to achieve US policy goals. Trump essentially does away with that, and he prioritizes unilateral action. But then there is also a broader rejection here, and this is this identity security or identity policy nexus of American exceptionalism and liberal hegemony. And this nexus of identity and policy was essentially the idea that, yes, the United States is the indispensable nation in world affairs, as Madeleine Albright put it in the 1990s, and that America needs to use its superior economic and military power to defend the values of freedom and democracy that constitute the United States, and that this is this morally this is the moral imperative of American leadership of a liberal international order. And Trump, by and large, rejects this ideal of American exceptionalism. He says the United States actually isn't exceptional. He rejects the associated costs of American leadership. So, for example, his constant griping about NATO, that the United States is paying too much, that the others are owing the United States vast sums of money. So in Trump's rhetoric, in Trump's America First narrative, America isn't actually an exceptional nation charged with remaking the rest of the world in its own democratic image, but it is a sucker and loser that has been ripped off by its allies and partners for decades. And I just
define American exceptionalism.
I just wanted to show you a quick clip here from 2016, where Trump is at a conservative campaign event in Texas, the Texas Patriots PAC, and he is asked this question about American exceptionalism. And I think his response is quite telling, and it shows you the America First mindset. Okay, here we go.
Define American exceptionalism. Does American exceptionalism still exist? And what do we do to grow American exceptionalism?
Okay, well, I don't like the term. I'll be honest with you. And people will say, "Oh, he's not patriotic." Look, I don't like the term. I'll be honest with you. And people will say, "Oh, he's not patriotic." Look, if I'm a Russian, or if I'm a German, or if I'm a person we do business with, why? I don't think it's a very nice term. We're exceptional. You're not. First of all, Germany is eating our lunch. So they say, why are you exceptional? We're doing a lot better than you. I never liked the term. And perhaps that's because I don't have a very big ego and I don't need terms like that. But honestly, when you're doing business, I mean, I watch Obama every once in a while say American exceptionalism. I don't like the term because we deal, first of all, I want to take everything back from the world that we've given them. We've given them so much. On top of taking it back, I don't want to say we're exceptional. We're more exceptional. Because essentially, you're saying we're more outstanding than you. By the way, you've been eating our lunch for the last 20 years, but we're more exceptional than you. I don't like the term. I never liked it. When I see the
all right. So as you can say here, Trump rejects this idea of American exceptionalism because, quote, everybody has eating our lunch. And this rejection of American exceptionalism is something that is quite unprecedented when you look at presidential rhetoric over, the last 20 years, over the post-Cold War period, because pretty much every American president has alluded to American exceptionalism in some form and has used it in some form to legitimate foreign policy decisions in the context of US national security. So Trump rejects this idea in 2016. For example, when asked about Vladimir Putin, he says, we are, Putin is a killer, but, we are also not innocent. And this rejection of American exceptionalism also had an impact on US foreign policy. So, for example, when the Saudi journalist Kamal Khashoggi is killed in the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul, Trump prioritizes US weapons sales and essentially says that I don't want to let go of these economic opportunities. So essentially support for human rights, support for democracy, those cease to be foreign policy priorities under the Trump administration. So very insignificantly, any sort of notion of idealism, liberal ideals of a morally guided foreign policy, all of that pretty much goes out of the window, which again shows that there is a very strong realist element to Trump's nationalist populist articulation of foreign policy. Now, let's take a look how all of this worked out in practice. Now, as I said, there is a discrepancy here between this nationalist populist rhetoric on the one side.
And then where did you, and then you took the tube back?
We took the tube to what happened in practice. So on the one side, some of the clearest manifestations of America First is Trump's cancellation of several multilateral agreements that were, again, signature element of Obama's foreign policy of cooperative engagement. So one of Trump's first acts in office is he terminates the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement. Trump withdraws from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, and Trump also withdraws from the Iran nuclear agreement. Now, these are pretty easy achievements in a certain way because Trump can simply use executive orders to remove the United States from these international agreements. In other respects, though, the impact of nationalist populism or the impact of America First is much less pronounced. So despite Trump's repeated hostile remarks on NATO, for example, when we look to what happens practically, materially under the Trump administration, the United States actually enhances its support for the NATO alliance. More than 8,000 US troops are stationed in Eastern Europe on a rotational basis as part of the European Reassurance Initiative that was originally launched under President Obama. And that European Reassurance Initiative, so deterrence initiative, is actually increased by 50% in terms of budgetary expenditures. 2018, we have Trident Juncture, the largest NATO exercise since the end of the Cold War, again, to deter Russian aggression on NATO member states in Eastern Europe. The United States supplies almost half of the 40,000 troops that attend this maneuver. So there is a very clear discrepancy here between Trump saying, NATO is obsolete and they're owing us vast sums of money, and why are we, defending these feckless Europeans that are underpaying, and the United States actually being a stalwart, reliable ally. And again, I think the main reason for this is that Trump staffs his national security establishment, his national security team, not with America First MAGA guys, but with establishment figures, in particular former generals. Right? Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, is a former four-star general, the U.S. Marine Corps. H.R. McMaster, National Security Advisor, three-star general, U.S. Army. John Kelly, a first Homeland Secretary, and then Trump's Chief of Staff, another four-star general. So these are by and large seasoned military establishment figures that are still invested in the status quo of liberal hegemony, the United States acting as a primary security guarantor for its allies and partners in the Asia Pacific and in Europe via NATO, for example. So on a structural level, then, we don't actually have a radical remaking of US foreign policy as a result of America First. There's not a strategic rapprochement with Russia. There's not a massive drawdown of US forces from Japan and South Korea. The United States does not leave NATO. Partially, this is also because Congress, for example, has this bipartisan legislation to prevent Trump from unilaterally withdrawing NATO. Other initiatives are essentially slow-walked or terminated via the federal bureaucracy. If you read the books by Bob Woodward, you will find episodes where Gary Cohn, Trump's chief economic advisor, literally steals letters from Trump's desk where he's about to terminate NAFTA. And that is an outcome that is seen as a national security nightmare in the White House. So they basically literally nicked the letter before he can sign it. So again, you can see that the White House administration is often at odds with their own America First president. But nonetheless, there is an impact on America First. And this impact is predominantly on the ideational level in terms of perceptions of global audiences and other governments about the reliability of the United States, about the credibility of US security guarantees, for example. Angela Merkel put it this way: the times where we can completely rely on others, they are partially over. And as you can see in these public opinion polls here, there is a dramatic loss of confidence in the United States, and in particular in Trump as president, among long-standing stalwart allies of the United States, such as Germany, such as France, and the UK, for example. Now, this is what happens, if you will, on the international side. But what is interesting here is that when we look to the domestic context, that America First was actually very popular. So Trump's approval ratings among Republican voters were in excess of 80%. America First policies, terminating these free trade agreements, criticizing NATO, were very much supported with an overwhelming majority of Republican voters. as they were singularly unpopular with Democratic voters. And this is where we have to talk about political representation and partisan polarization in the United States. So simply put, partisan polarization has accelerated in the United States ever since the Obama presidency. Republicans are moving further to the right, Democrats are moving further to the left, although Republicans are moving much further than to the right than Democrats move to the left. Coalition of voters in the United States are divided by many markers of identity, such as gender, level of education, race, socioeconomic status. And increasingly what we're having is two opposing coalitions, a Republican coalition made up of older, white, male voters working in working class professions without a college degree, concentrated in rural areas, and a Democratic-leaning coalition made up of college-educated voters, women voters, ethnic minority voters, and urban populations. And these two voting coalitions hold diametrically opposing views, for example, in 2016 on the issue of immigration, the construction of the US-Mexico border wall, or free trade. So more than 60% of Republican voters supported the wall, more of 60% of Hillary Clinton voters rejected it. Similar picture emerges on free trade. So on many key foreign policy issues, we have literally completely opposite alternative political realities between Republican voters and Democratic voters. What animates Trump voters, which are even to the right of the average Republican voter, is a sense of political alienation, economic insecurity, and cultural anxiety, particularly tied to demographic changes. So the United States moving in the direction of a majority-minority country by the mid of the 21st century, the impact of immigration, and this idea, as the sociologist Ali Hochschild said, that they are now strangers in their own land. They are losing the United States. The America is changing and they are rejecting this change. So a lot of what animates Trump voters is this sense of national decline, but also a sociocultural decline and anxiety of relative deprivation, of that their special status isn't recognized, that they are undeserving others that are becoming more than them. And these attitudes are very much amplified and reinforced by Trump, who is saying, yes, they are robbing you, they are shipping your jobs overseas with these terrible free trade agreements, they are letting the immigrants in that rob you and murder you. So his speeches are full of these anecdotes of ordinary Americans, dying at the hands of criminal immigrants in a violent fashion. So he very much reinforces and amplifies these fears, these anxieties, the xenophobia, and quite frankly, also the racism that is prevalent amongst Trump's base. And as I said, you can see here from this Pew survey in 2016 on hostility to immigration, for example, on xenophobia, Islamophobia, Trump voters are even more hostile and are even more pronounced in their hostilities than, for example, the average Republican voter. So what happens then with these America First rhetoric and these populist security narratives that Trump mobilizes about, nefarious foreigners and criminal immigrants and ruinous free trade deals, is that on the one side, he addresses a particular segment of the electorate, this predominantly white, working class, non-college educated constituency that is more hostile in their views than even average Republicans. But also he articulates concerns about free trade. He articulates concerns about military interventionism and the degree of America's global engagement that simply were not represented at the elite level, because average American public opinion is much more restrained in its endorsement of internationalism than foreign policy elites, which, for example, almost unanimously supported free trade as good for the American economy because it lowered, for example, costs for American consumers. If you are a voter, for example, in Detroit, Michigan, and you worked at a GM factory, and that factory is now gone, and you can only get a job that maybe like pays half as much. The fact that like, Chinese imports of, electronics and consumer goods are now like $5 cheaper are probably like less relevant to your immediate felt reality of your own social status and your own well-being. And this is something that I think many politicians missed, that many economists also missed, but Trump picked up on that, and he very successfully mobilized this loss frame, this deprivation frame, this sense of decline. So here we can see, some of these surveys are then again done by Pew in 2016 before the election between Clinton and Trump, on more restrained attitudes when it comes to free trade between the general public and foreign policy elites, and also that after 2 decades of military interventions following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, many Americans were increasingly weary of global engagement. And this was something that was not articulated at all by Hillary Clinton, for example, who was a staunch liberal hawk who talked about establishing a no-fly zone in Syria, for example, intervention in the Civil War, which, given the presence of Russia in that conflict, sort of like even implied a willingness to take on Russian forces there. And so this hostility to free trade, this wariness about military interventions, wasn't really represented in the Democratic Party. Trump very much represented it. And he gave a voice to views that weren't really articulated on the political stage up to this point. And that successful exploitation of this representational gap between popular opinion, public opinion, and elite opinion partially explains this success of Trump. I think I'm like running a little bit over time here, so I'm just going to come to the close here. So in this gap then between elite and public opinion, what we can say is that what has been referred to as the blob by Ben Rhodes, Obama's deputy national security advisor, this sort of homogenous bipartisan US foreign policy establishment in the United States that like always recommends military intervention as a response to any international crisis or foreign policy event, that has this very unquestioning attitude to American leadership, American exceptionalism, American superiority. Trump and Trump's America First rhetoric was very much a successful intervention against this discursive authority, against this legitimacy of the blob of this US foreign policy establishment. And one element I think where we see this very well is on this question of the so-called forever wars. Because on the one side, America First is this nationalist populist rejection of the Washington establishment and everything it stands for. But at the same time, there's also a hefty doses of militarism, Jacksonian unilateralism in Trump's rhetoric, in his demeanor, and frankly also in his policy decisions that is very much compatible with a long-standing Republican foreign policy tradition. So Trump, for example, absolutely launches cruise missiles on Syria on 2 occasions. He escalates airstrikes in Afghanistan to an hitherto unprecedented level. But then at the same time, Trump also seems particularly risk averse when it comes to military losses. So he doesn't actually begin new military engagements beyond the ones that he himself has inherited in office. And he also promotes a very distinctive anti-interventionist narrative. So in 2019 and 2020, for example, Trump sends out dozens of tweets denigrating endless wars. He is very hostile to hawks in his own administration, like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, that want to launch airstrikes against Iran for the downing of a US reconnaissance drones. He clashes publicly with his national security advisor, John Bolton, who was once described as a peculiar combination of Yosemite Sam and Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, but who is definitely a hawk, who is definitely somebody who would, who wants to basically operate militarily against Iran as part of a maximum coercion strategy. And Trump does mobilize resentment against this hawkish against these hawkish members of his own cabinet. And this populist agitation against endless wars is also that is something that is picked up, for example, by Joe Biden and Democratic candidates in the 2020 election. So one result of America First, I would argue, and this narrative mobilization against endless wars is a shifting of popular attitudes in the United States away from military interventionism and toward greater military restraint. And that carries on beyond the Trump administration. And I think the best manifestation of this, or the most obvious manifestation of this, is Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan and to honor the withdrawal agreement negotiated between the Trump administration and the Taliban. They're just tinkering with the deadline. They bring it, pushing it back to September. Then events overtake them. But Biden goes against the wisdom of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, who decry this unacceptable loss of American credibility. And he says, enough is enough. I'm not going to hand over this unsuccessful war that is stuck in a strategic stalemate for years to yet another American president. And that very much echoes this anti-interventionist, non-interventionist sentiment of America First. And that is kind of like what I want to close with, is that the Biden presidency in many ways is not this radical repudiation of America First. Yes, on the one side, Biden says, you know, America is back, America is ready to lead again. America does take a very obvious international leadership role in the war in Ukraine, coordinating the weapon supplies by its European and NATO allies and partners. But in many other areas, the Biden presidency is more of a continuation of America First, a protectionist economic policy that, you know, prioritizes national industrial revitalization via the IRA, and a Buy America policy rather than new free trade agreements, for example. A strategic competition with China, identifying China as a hostile strategic rival and talking about long-term political, military, economic competition. That is a direct continuation, if you will, with a slightly softened rhetoric from the Trump administration. And in many ways, you know, Biden, who says that we need to have a foreign policy that serves the American middle class, that is by and large the same argument that Trump made, right? That ordinary Americans have been let down, for example, by the free trade agreements and policies of the past. So Biden in many ways promotes a sort of soft left-wing populist rhetoric on economic and trade issues, where Trump's was a right-wing populist argument. Was the very important difference, though, that where Trump rejected this idea of a liberal international order and America's leadership of it, Biden very much re-emphasizes this and reinforces this. So just to bring this to a close, because I think I'm like horribly over time here, America First is essentially a discourse that links anti-elitism and anti-globalism. Its impact, I would say, has been predominantly on the ideational side and putting question marks on America's reliability and durability as a lead in international affairs. It was very much a narrative disruption within the United States, disrupting this identity policy nexus of American exceptionalism and liberal hegemony. But just because it was predominantly on this narrative ideational level in the first Trump administration doesn't mean it would stay that way if Trump gets reelected in the presidency. I think if Trump gets reelected, he will very much staff top positions in his administration for defense, for foreign policy with MAGA loyalists, and we could expect a more structural remaking of US foreign policy as a result. And with that comforting thought, I will lead you, and I look forward to your questions later.
Thank you very much, Georg. That was a really kind of nuanced, coherent, but also exceptionally thorough exploration of Trump's America First paradigm, and I think also how it's interplay with domestic politics, which I think the book probably speaks to extremely well. But whenever I see you present, I think you have a really good grasp of that, and I think that's something that we should definitely discuss. We've now got 20 minutes to split into breakout rooms. I don't know if I'm meant to be organizing the rooms.
I've already did, John. Thank you so much. So our participants knows that they're going to be directed to the discussion rooms. you only need to accept the invitation. It appears on your screen. And for John and George, you may have your time to rest a bit because they will come back with very good questions.
Okay.
We can
Great.
keep the link. You can just turn off your mic and camera and you can rest.
Okay, great. Sounds good. Cheers.
We will be back at 12.
Yeah. Okay, got it.
Okay. See you.
Bye.
Yeah, before you leave, just I would like to remind you that on Friday, there'll be a case competition session with presentations, and it's exactly within your topic,
Yeah.
US foreign policy and populism. They'll choose a real life problem and they'll bring some policy suggestions. So I'll be so happy if you could both can stand on the committee of assessment, and it will be great if you can do that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Great,
No
great.
problem.
Jonny, do you have time as well for that?
What time of the day is it?
It's at 12:30.
I could work out myself. Like,
Yeah,
It's at 12.
at 12. Yeah, on Friday.
That is it 11 UK time? Or
Yes, 11 UK time. Right.
still get this confused. Perfect. Yes. Yeah.
yeah, I can do that.
Great, great. Okay. Thank you so much.